Hello, and welcome to this short video about how to use visual aids in your Speech 1113 class. I am your instructor, Dr. Jason Stone, Associate Professor of Communication at OSU OKC. On the slide that's being displayed right now, we have a couple of different things. We have some images from our course. We have an image that we use with our asteroid election, which is a component of our persuasive speaking module. We have an image from Mardi Gras that we use as an example in our informative speaking module and in ways that you organize informative presentations. All of these are examples of visual aids. A wise person once said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Your textbook says that a video is worth 1,000 pictures. So theoretically, a video, the right video, could be worth 1,000,000. Visual aids are really important for public speaking, and there's several reasons why they're important displayed on this slide. They decrease speaker anxiety. It helps you to get and keep the audience's attention. It can assist at attempts at humor. The comedian John Oliver is really good at that. It helps you maintain your credibility. It demonstrates preparation, and it helps visual learners absorb information. So let's look at an empirical example of when. Let's look at a historical example where a visual aid was very important. While I'm speaking, go ahead and get your phone out and Google Alice Seeley Harris. And give yourself a second to read up on her. She was a nun who left England and went to the Democratic Republic of Congo. At the time, it was the Belgian Congo. And one of the things that she had in her possession was a camera. I compare this camera to the cell phones that all of the students in on-site sections have in their pockets. And I observed that you have, much more computing power, much more photographic power than Alice Seeley Harris did in 1904 in the Belgian Congo. You will also note that there are lots of different lenses on that for different angles. And we weren't just putting 3 and 4 and 5 cameras on cameras back in the day. That's not a recent phenomenon. That's also something we were doing back in the day. This is, of course, the zoom, and whereas you would pull this thing out and double click on it a little bit, and do something like that, to zoom in. Here you had to manipulate this screw to get things into focus. And this was a gigantic piece of equipment. It was on a tripod. It would have had a floor, sort of footprint, well in addition of in excess of over 6 square feet. It would have taken up a lot of space. So at the time in 1904, though, this was the most portable, the most user-friendly camera available with which to take photographs. And you had to have a lot of money and a lot of disposable income to engage in the habit of photography. Alice Seeley Harris was a missionary, and she is seen in this next photo posing with some young people who she saved. And she saved them from some of the ravages of capitalism. And we'll kind of see what I'm talking about in this next slide. Now, if you are sensitive to images of death and dismemberment, I would encourage you to skip ahead until we are done talking about missionary Harris. In the next slide, a young man walked up to the mission and asked for Alice Seeley Harris's help in pursuing justice for something that happened to his family. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Belgian Congo in 1904, the Belgians engaged in rubber quotas, and they wanted people who were working for them to produce a certain amount of rubber. If the people did not produce an appropriate amount of rubber, then they were beaten, their children were kidnapped, and if they missed the rubber quota repeatedly, their children would be dismembered. And I am inset over, my video of my face is inset on the PowerPoint slideshow where Nasala, who is pictured in this photograph, is staring at the dismembered hands and feet of the children of his village because his village did not make the rubber quota, and agents of the Belgian government dismembered his children. Well, this is, of course, a human rights violation. It's a crime. It's an act of war. And it's horribly, horribly unethical and immoral. At the time, people didn't know that this was happening. And Alice Seeley Walker did the only thing she could. She turned her camera onto the horror to produce change. Some of the Congolese weren't immediately dismembered. They got a warning first, and typically the warning included lashes. Here we see some people who survived dismemberment, and they are being photographed with their dismembered limbs. And obviously, you know, the horror that happened in the Belgian Congo over the rubber quotas is one of the worst things that happened in the 1900s. And it was a century filled with atrocities, but none of them were worse than the dismemberment of Congolese citizens at the hands of the Belgians for failing to meet the rubber production. This is also a great example of how an image, how a camera can really, really make a difference in global opinion. And as soon as word of this got circulated in newspapers and word of what was happening in the Congo got around, there was a groundswell of public opinion to stop that practice, and things got better for the citizens of the Belgian Congo after those photographs and after those visual aids were produced. Your ability to produce a visual aid may be critical to securing your human rights, to the human rights of others, and may be critical to securing the support of audience members who you need to be your allies in controversies. Here we have a human brain bisected, and the image here is not bisected bilaterally this way, it's bisected bilaterally this way. So if there was to be kind of a bandsaw that just sort of moved across a skull right at the eyeball, this would be the section that we would see from that cut. And what we have here is a cross-section of kind of how the eyes are situated into and around the brain, and how the brain kind of encompasses the eyes. Some gestational biologists talk about human gestation and the development of a human fetus in utero. And they hypothesize that the eyes are actually formed in the brain and then shoot into the ocular cavity and then continue to develop while they're inside of the ocular cavity or the orbital cavity there. So you have a tremendous amount of biology being explained in this slide. You have your retinas, which are an important part of the eyes, and that helps to flip and stabilize the image because most of what we see is actually upside down. You have a number of different processes involved in the anatomy of the brain, and we have a whole lot of right and left, kind of cones and rods and all sorts of things being interpreted into impulses. All of those impulses go around lots of nerve endings and nerve bundles and kind of come back here to the back part of the brain, which is where most of the visual processing center of the brain actually is. If you've ever played a contact sport like soccer or basketball or football or hockey, and you've had an impact to your head and you've seen stars, essentially that is a little mini concussion where the back part of your head is getting impacted, and there's been an impact. Your brain has slid in your cerebral spinal fluid and has backed up to the back part of your head, and that causes a mini concussion. And that's where you experience the mini concussion, is in the back part of your visual cortex, right there. This is that other cross section of the human brain, kind of taken from the side. So not necessarily like a cross section, but sort of a side view, kind of like that of the brain. We see the occipital lobe, which is the primary visual cortex. We see control of eye movements. We see some of those processes that we talked about, kind of put together. Then we see the ocular motor neurons, and we see the optic nerve. Important to note, according to John Medina in his 2014, and he's a neuroscientist, according to his 2014 book, Brain Rules, more than 50% of your human brain resources are devoted to visual processing. So more than 50% of your total brain volume is dedicated to visual processing and to sight. That is why it is so powerful to touch on people's proclivity to use their sight and their preference to use their sight in learning. This next graphic is from Laird in '85, and it just talks about the way that people learn and through the 5 different senses, how they learn the most. And approximately 10% of the population is geared to be an auditory processor, and many more are cued to be visual learners. And then more than 6%, again, it's about 10% of the population is geared towards kinesthetic learning or has a preference to learn by doing. This next slide compares and contrasts the effectiveness of just telling a message auditorily versus hearing, versus watching a message, kind of closed caption style, or a combination of those two things. And it also compares and contrasts those two modalities or the combination of those two modalities within 3 hours of hearing a message and 3 days of hearing a message. And the most impressive recall was at 3 days, people who both were shown and told a message at a combination of those presentations retained over 60% of the message after 3 days. And that is the most effective combination of senses to encourage long-term recall. Also, if we can recall something for 3 days, typically we can recall something for quite a long period of time. Usually if we recall it for 3 days, it's been cached into long-term memory. So here are a number of recommendations for using visual aids in our class. And if you are taking photographs of some of these slides, I would encourage you to take a photograph of that slide. This all comes to us from Stephen A. Lucas's book, The Art of Public Speaking. And we thank Professor Lucas for these learned interjections. I'm going to talk about each of these in order. And we recommend that you don't use the dry erase board. None of you are professional artists. It consumes a lot of speaking time. Penmanship is going to increase your anxiety, and the potential for misspelling is going to increase your anxiety. And your bad penmanship might actually decrease your credibility. I hope that none of you will judge me too harshly based on my penmanship. And I'll read that sentence for you. If you've ever misspelled something in Christmas lights, you might be a redneck. If you've done it on a whiteboard, then you should have used PowerPoint. And clearly you can use a PowerPoint or you can use a whiteboard. You could potentially have a little whiteboard and draw something out and explain that to us. That would be one way to do a visual aid, even in an online class. However, I guess the point that I'm making is if you're using a whiteboard, if you're just doing anything more than just kind of an on-the-fly sort of impromptu kind of discussion or explanation, you are causing yourself more stress and you're going to increase your own anxiety. And if you've ever misspelled something in Christmas lights, then you might be a redneck. It took me a long time to find that image on the internet. And I suppose if someone was proposing marriage to a woman named Christmas, that might be a grammatically correct sentence. That might be a grammatically correct phrase. As it is, that is something misspelled in Christmas lights, kids. And that is not. Again, do not use the dry erase board. It does not show significant artistic accomplishment, and you should only use the dry erase board to explain something on the fly that you didn't have time to make a slide for. The next recommendation is to prepare the visual aid in advance. And we have a graphic here that I use in our class kind of frequently. We have a woman who's engaged in some environmental analysis. She's about ready to speak. Presumably the visual aid will be displayed behind her on some type of a screen behind her. So she's thinking about what it's going to look like for the rest of the audience members. And now I think is a great time for us to potentially talk about fonts and talk about font sizes and talk about print in your PowerPoints. So let's do that. And I make a game out of, can you read this with some of the students in the class? And that is 12-point font. Clearly, it's a little easier to see in a computer-mediated format, but if it's being projected in a classroom, that can be difficult to read. That's 12-point font contrasted with a font that's twice as big, the 24-point font. And then, of course, that's contrasted with the 36-point font. 36-point font is easy to read in almost any speaking venue. 24-point font will be fairly easy to read if you're not speaking in too big a venue. If you have a number of audience members who are a long ways away from the projector, you need to make sure that you're using a font that's big enough for them to be able to see anything that you need them to be able to see on your slides. In addition to font size, you also need to be aware of contrast, and contrast in fonts is very important. And here we have a good example of that. I split this slide in two so that you can sort of see how a black text pops on a white background and how white text pops on a black background. You want to try to create the most amount of contrast possible so that people can understand your text. So this is an actual background that I saw in a presentation that was delivered by a senior executive in the OSU system. This person has now gone on to be a university president. And this was a slideshow that they presented to all of the OSU OKC faculty members one morning during in-service one spring. We had just come out with these new like OSU light orange Pantone colors, and we had just officially adopted a new official gray. So I think that this leader was in a hurry to use these new official colors in something. And we had a chance to interact with that speaker the first time they used this slideshow. So I direct your attention up here, and this is where I'm going to drop the first bit of text in. And this entire series of slides and this entire kind of exploration of this slide is a study in contrast and a study in making text pop. And it's also a study in designing a custom background that may or may not serve much of a purpose. So there I just dropped the first little bit of text in, and that's a 12-point font. And now I just dropped in another little bit of text, and that's a 20-point font. For the most part, this senior OSU leader used this 20-point font. And then there's a 32-point font. And my text reads, "I'm sure none of you are having any trouble reading this!" exclamation point. And it's a 32-point font. And then here we have a 40-point font, but we see that the background is, obscuring part of our text, and it makes it very difficult to read through that. So if we were to not use gray text on a black background, and if we were to use black text with a black background and a gray background, this is what that design decision would look like. And then finally, we have really the only acceptable, only readable answer for this particular background, and that is to use white text. The background itself is so dark that really no other colors other than light colors, like maybe yellow or white, are actually going to ever pop on this particular background. So please be aware of the contrast, and in particular be aware of the contrast that you are creating or obscuring with your colors and with your font choices. Speakers also need to be aware of the fonts that they're choosing. And this is a good time to talk about serifs versus sans serif fonts. The font on the left is almost a cursive type of font. And we have, little embellishments here at the end of the two. Because that embellishment is in the middle of the O, it is not a A. The embellishment in the middle makes it an O. And then here we would have, if there was another letter that they wanted to connect to the O, that stem becomes the place where they would do it. So these little stems, these little embellishments, these little things that help our words connect to other words, those are examples of serifs. To the right here, we have Arial font, and Arial font does not have any of these serifs. Again, these things are serifs. Arial font doesn't have that. It's easy to read, it's written in clear fonts, and communicates easily. The general rule of thumb is if something is only going to be viewed digitally, you want to use a sans serif font. If something will be actually printed and people are going to look at a printout of it, you want to use a serifed font. Times New Roman is an example of a default old school serifed font. Aptos, Calibri, and Arial are all examples of sans serif fonts. Let's look real quick at negative space and look at some of these fonts. We have some negative space here. Humans read in an F format. So we start here at an F, we scroll across the top, we go down, and we look for another place to jump in as far as the text goes. So real good use of negative space. Negative space is where there's not really any color and there's not really any text. So that would be some negative space. All of this is negative space. There's negative space here between some of these logos. All those are examples of negative space. So you want to be aware of your font, but you also want to be aware of your negative space, and you don't want to overcrowd your slide. Here we have some specific fonts, and the three to the left are sans serif fonts. They don't have any serifs. Geometric, Humanist, Old Style, those don't have any fonts. As opposed to the T, the M, and the S, the transitional, the modern, and the slab serif. So this little ending, this little beginning, this little leg, this little foot on the M, this little hat on the M, this little embellishment on the T here, where this part of it isn't just a straight across line. It actually comes down a little bit. That's a serif. This little foot at the bottom of the text, that's a serif. Okay, and again, sans serif if you're not going to print it. And if you are going to print it, it should have a serif. The serif makes it easier to read in person. Sans serif makes it easier to read on a computer. Some of you are very familiar with color theory and you understand the emotions that different colors convey. Some of you are largely unfamiliar with that. There's a lot of companies right now that are rebranding, and they're rebranding to try to claim like pink, purple, chartreuse, kind of this blue. These colors are associated with trust, and there's a lot of companies that are rebranding, trying to sell you on trust. You should search the triadic color wheel, and you should become more familiar with the triadic color wheel. That will help you make good, sound decisions based on color theory as you integrate colors into your presentations. When it comes to color in your fonts, usually less is more, and we have a couple of different examples of that displayed on the slide. So you want to display the visual aid where the listeners can see them, and you want to avoid passing the visual aid out into the audience. Now, obviously, this pertains more to an on-site class, but I have a little example here that I'll show you. I had a student who gave a speech about Australia and a trip that she took to Australia. And she talked about being in the Great Barrier Reef and seeing the Sydney Opera House and camping, next to a bunch of poisonous spiders and swimming in the reef. She had a great time. It was a really cool trip. She was speaking to a class that was seated in tables, kind of like this. she would pull up a photograph and kind of talk about it and then pass it out. Pull up a photograph, talk about it, and pass it out. Pull up a photograph, talk about it, and pass it out. Well, if you spend just, a minute talking about one of the photographs and you pass out 9 photographs, they're still going to be looking at your photographs several speeches in the future. Like if you are the first speaker, they might still be looking at some of your photographs when the last speaker is talking. So you've not only not done a good job presenting your visual aid, you created a distraction with your visual aid that took away from the attention that some of the other speakers should have gotten. And instead, they didn't get that attention. Instead, the audience members were looking at your visual aid during their speech. Display those visual aids only where the audience can see them, and also don't pass the visual aids out into the audience. And then next here is display those visual aids only while you're discussing them. So you can make the visual aid kind of go away, and you can do that a couple different ways. You can use black slides to focus attention back on you as the speaker. And there's the detailed instructions for producing one of those. You can also check those directions out. Another thing that you can do is you can insert them here. You can use like a text box and format that and make it black. You can also use Shift B if you're in presentation mode in PowerPoint. You can use Shift B, and that will help you to make the slide essentially go away. I'll press it now and you'll see. Okay, so I'm in presentation mode, I guess recording, and I'm not sure that it will work in recording mode. But if you're just in presentation mode and you're not recording, you can hit Shift B, and it will make the slides black out, and then all the focus will be back on you as the speaker, and you won't be competing with your visual aid for the audience's attention. Next is talk to your visual aid, talk to your audience, not your visual aid. And again, I think that in an online class with PitchVantage, it's much easier to do that. In an on-site section, you see frequently if a speaker doesn't know what's on the slideshow, they'll kind of turn around and look at the slideshow and read off of the slideshow, and then turn back and look at the audience. And it's kind of what we see this speaker doing. He's not really sure, where the data point is, so he turns and kind of refreshes his memory. And then this is what this speaker is doing. She's actually turned her back to the audience and is not presenting her best side. Next is explain the visual aid clearly and concisely. So you want to be as word economical in your discussion of the visual aid as you can be. Few of you may be old enough that you're Charlie Brown fans, or that you watched the Peanut specials growing up, and that of course was Charlie Brown's teacher. And anytime Charlie Brown's teacher spoke in the classroom, that was her voice. And it was distorted, and it was meant to kind of be confusing and meant to convey that sometimes when little kids are at school, they find the lessons confusing and overwhelming. And I thought that Charlie Brown's teacher is a great touchstone for confusing professors. So keeping that in mind, we have a confusing professor up here at the lectern. Thus, after squaring the applicable prime numbers, we are ready to divide by the number of participants in the experimental group. The quotient should be similar to our original hypothesis. Sometimes we think we're being real clear and we're not communicating very much. The best example of being concise with an explanation of a visual aid that I have seen happened with a speaker who was a student at UCO when I was a professor out there. She was actually a member of the golf team. She wanted to talk about what she knew about, and she was going to talk to us a little bit about golf and about reading golf greens. And she produced a slide that looked a lot like this. It had a hole for a ball to go in. It had an example of the natural kind of undulation of a green. It had a sort of a topographical kind of elevation map. It had a distance map that showed some of the peculiarities of that particular hole. And then finally it had this thing, which was an air caddy tripod. And that is the actual LiDAR thing that shoots a laser all over the golf course and takes all these telemetry measurements. And then you can look at the air caddy right there, on your phone and kind of look at a readout of what the golf course looks like, the one that you're playing right then. So this revolutionized her golf game, and she did a tremendous job explaining all of the things on this slide really efficiently and really quickly. I was blown away at how little time it took her to narrate all of that. It did happen a little while ago, so I don't have a video of it. That's too bad. The golfer public speaker was able to be so effective because she had written down everything that she wanted to say about that visual aid on her note card. She then just kind of read off of the note card as she was describing the visual aid. And because we were all looking at the visual aid, we didn't really notice very much that she was reading, pretty much word for word what she wanted to say about the visual aid. Again, it can increase perceptions of your competence and of your credibility to read that part of the speech. And it certainly did for her. So that's explained the VA clearly and concisely. Final recommendation on this list and this part of the lecture is to practice with your visual aids. Get your visual aids done in advance of the presentation and practice the speech several times using the visual aids. That will help you explain them more clearly and concisely, and may even show you where you need to take something out of your presentation. Again, all those are adapted from Stephen A. Lucas, The Art of Public Speaking. So we are back to that speaker who's engaged in the environmental analysis and wondering how the visual aids are going to be displayed. And she may be thinking about some of these things, and these are some design tips for making visual aids. Again, if you are taking photographs of my slides, this is a good one to take a photograph of. Let's spend a couple minutes talking about some of these. We've already belabored some of these in some detail, contrast, for instance. So we won't, labor things that we've already talked about, but let's look at this recommendation. And I would say that I got all of these from REMA Training, which is a UK-based business consulting firm. First is simplicity, and we have here the acronym KISS, or Keep It Simple, Stupid. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. We also have consistency, maintain consistent visual style. This bullet here is a good example of consistency in this presentation. I use the same kind of bullet throughout this presentation. Clarity, you should make sure that the visuals are easy to understand at a glance and that you're using intuitive icons. Tailor your visual aids for that specific audience. Balance different elements visually across the space. Contrast is very important, in particular if you're looking at text. Your text needs to have a lot of contrast. We've talked about that. And then finally, design for impact. In some of the slides that follow, we're going to talk about this concept of designing for impact. I think that there's a number of great social media influencers and YouTube channels out there that are trying to coach you how to make your PowerPoint slides for the maximum amount of impact. And I'll point out some of the new cool looks from some of these different influencers that I got along the way as we deconstruct some of these slides. So let's look at these recommendations, and then let's look at some different design recommendations that I have for you, and some influencers that I recommend that you follow. This is a great example of a more contemporary kind of slide. The slide to the left is what a lot of preview slides used to look like. So in today's presentation, we're going to talk about mastering Excel dynamics. We're going to learn the basics. We'll examine interactivity. We'll talk a little bit about data analysis. And then finally, we'll conclude with some advanced techniques. Okay. So that was pretty standard, for a preview statement. And usually the slide that accompanied the preview statement looked a lot like this slide here to the left. You will note in this slide that there is almost no negative space between these bullets. There is some negative space right here with this indentation where the presentation invites your eye, kind of in. Again, we're reading in that F pattern, right? So we read across and then we read down and then we look for places to jump in. Okay? So as opposed to this slide over here in the right, this is more contemporary. And what you're seeing on things like Canva is like people using the metaphor of a journey. So this is a piece of highway, right? So, life is a highway. The journey is a highway. The journey is a road. We're on the road to learning more about Excel, okay? So you can see how that can very easily translate into a lot of very specific, colorful language that can translate into some transition verbs that are themed with your topic. Let's talk next about icons, right? So some of these icons that I used, that's a gas tank filling up, a pump filling up a barrel. That's a pie, or not a pie chart, but a bar chart that shows an upward trend. That is a tablet where somebody could engage in some analysis. And that is a document that has a blue ribbon on it, okay? So we're getting gassed up. We're putting some fuel in the tank. We're getting the raw resources that we're going to need to burn to engage in our journey. Okay, those are basics, and that's why I chose that icon. Interactivity, one thing goes up, the other thing goes up, one thing goes down, the other thing goes down. They co-vary. That's a co-varying relationship. Analysis happens, for the most part on computers, and if you want to analyze something, you have to have some data so that you can get down into it and rip it apart. Advanced, well, if you're basic, you're not advanced, and if you're advanced, hopefully you got a ribbon and you won an award. And if you were basic, you didn't win the award because you would have just been considered entry level and basic. So I chose 4 icons that I felt like went with this, and then I stuck them on the road. And that is how you take something that is dry and really just involves, a lot of these text sort of based decisions, and that's how you punch it up for impact. By using icons and by using modern tools like Canva to pull in different sort of visual elements to your PowerPoint. This is a PowerPoint from Unix tutorial, and I thought that this was really cool, and I thought I would also kind of explain really quickly how they did it. You can, of course, watch the whole video on Unix tutorial. Unix tutorial went to the top ribbon and went insert shape, and then they selected a capsule, and then they drew one capsule, and then they drew a shorter capsule, and then they copied the first capsule and they pasted it on the other side of the shorter capsule, and then they offset that top capsule. So then after they had a little pattern together, they copied that pattern and they adjusted the pattern, and they were able to make this thing, this kind of unusually shaped object. All those at this point in this slide are individually put together objects. If you right click on the border right here and select group, PowerPoint will put all of those objects together in one object and will make them all the same object. Then you can right click on that object and you can set that object transparent. And then you can insert a photo behind it, and you've created this cool little frame from which, to evaluate things. And I think that that's a really neat, creative, modern, kind of look as far as PowerPoint goes. And again, that's from Unix tutorials. And here in a second, I will flash their information, and you can look them up on YouTube and follow them. I like this guy, Ven Giang. He is a frustrated magician, and he kind of describes himself as being one of the most talented magicians in the world, who is also the most boring speaker in the world. And he was doing these really high-level magic tricks, but it was all just kind of falling flat on his face, and he just had the opposite of charisma. When I say charisma in the on-site sections, I do this, and I dip a little. So you got that. This guy started studying public speaking, and he found that he was a better public speaking coach than he was magician. And Fortune 100 companies started asking him to come and speak about public speaking, and that's what he does for a living now. Now, he does try to hawk you a workshop, but if you need a public speaking coach after you leave this class, he is a good one. You might have to resist some of the sales attempts, but he has a lot of good content and a lot of good free content. Enix tutorials, I just recommended. They're the ones that came up with the cool little framing idea that I explained to you. They have almost 60,000 subscribers and 174 videos on YouTube. Most of those at the time of this construction of this slideshow had to do with PowerPoint. You also have Analyst Academy, and I think if you're going to be a small business owner or something like that, a lot of good stuff for you at the Analyst Academy. They'll tell you how to talk with a bank, how to make a business plan, how to engage in analysis, how to make decisions about complicated matters. Leela Gariani is another good one for small business folks. She'll teach you accounting and finance, Google Sheets, Microsoft Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, Office products. She has a lot of great tutorials that just kind of walk you through all of it. One Skill PowerPoint has about 70,000 subscribers and 200 videos, and most of those have to do with PowerPoint. And then finally, Master Your Talk, whereas Ven Gyang, I think, is a little bit more pop culture. Master Your Talk, I think, is a little more cerebral and academic, and this is ran by a former communication professor. These are some good folks for you to follow on Instagram or on YouTube, and they are people that you could also potentially give your communication analysis speech about. And I highly recommend that you give them a Google and become more familiar with them. So today we learned a little bit about visual aids. We talked about designing for impact. We talked about some social media influencers that you can follow if you want some additional information about that. And in particular, if you need some additional information about that after you've left this class. We also talked about some generic sort of recommendations for designing effective visual aids from Stephen A. Lucas. Designing visual aids are remarkably important. You may or may not be faced with a situation where you can spotlight civil rights abuses, but each of you will have an opportunity to construct visual aids where you try to teach us something and where you try to change our mind about something. And you may have an opportunity to construct a visual aid at some point after you leave this class that's much more high stakes. You may make something that winds up going intentionally viral as a result of some of the things that you've learned in this class. I think that you can take raw video, you can take pictures. I think that you can apply some of the concepts that you've learned in our lecture today, and that might make a video that you care about more viral than it would have normally been. And it might give you the ability to more effectively shape the world around you. Remember, this whole class is about putting tools in your toolbox so that when the time comes, you will be able to speak up and use your voice. And clearly, if you've got a great image, an image is worth 1,000 words. If you've got a great video is worth 1,000 images. So you have a real opportunity to turbocharge your communication with your visual aids and with your visual aid design choices. Take care of yourselves. Have a great day. Go Pokes.